Here is a horseshoe crab. This is one of my favorite animals in the world because it's a rare exception of an organism that has not evolved in over 300 million years. The horseshoe crab has adaptations or genetic features that make it more suited for its environment, that enable it to survive along shorelines and brackish environments. For most of life, life is bombarded by an ever-changing environment, and each species has two outcomes: evolve to these new conditions or go extinct. As of now, 99% of all life on Earth has gone extinct, but the components of life continue on since the first signs of life 400 billion years ago. Chapter 18: Evolution and Origin of Species. This is the beginning of my Principles of Biology 2 lectures designed for science majors. Nothing makes sense in biology except in light of evolution. This was an American biology teacher paper written by geneticist Theodosius Dobzhansky in 1973. Evolution is the unifying theory of biology. Questions regarding why organisms contain specific anatomical structures or develop specific behaviors or instincts, even its niche or role it plays in the environment, can all be linked to evolution. Recall that all life shares the same genetic code to translate mRNA codons into amino acids, and all life is made up of cells. These are further evidence that all life evolved from a single cell 4 billion years ago. This picture depicts an Archaeopteryx, a transitional species between reptiles and birds that existed 150 million years ago in the Jurassic period of Earth's history. It basically walked alongside Allosauruses, Brontosauruses, and many of the other dinosaurs we know and love. This animal had a similar ecological role to a gliding squirrel. Note the beak-like head and feathers found in birds, but the tailbone, teeth, and forearm digits seen in reptiles. Those digits are more fused in birds. Though Charles Darwin is credited with developing the theory of evolution, previous scientists, philosophers, and thinkers provided the tenets of evolutionary theory that helped Darwin. Up until the 18th century, it was thought that the species existing today were static and unchanging. However, the work of Hergé's Louis Leclerc Comte de Buffon made an important observation that animal and plant populations differed even when the environments look similar. And I do apologize for, messing up that French accent. For example, succulents, or thick-leaved plants in deserts, look similar, but are genetically distant. This appearance is caused by the selection pressures of dry habitats favoring plants that could store water in thick, waxy leaves. The theory of evolution also gives credit to discoveries in geology, which is the study of the Earth. James Hutton, a Scottish geologist, proposed that geological events such as mountain building and erosion are the result of slow, gradual changes rather than sudden, catastrophic events. In other words, he proposed that the Earth was much older than popularly thought. At least in Western European thought, based on Judeo-Christian beliefs, the Earth was only 6,000 years old. This idea was developed from Archbishop Ussher, who used a chronology of the Bible to date the creation of Earth to October 23rd, 4004 BC. Unfortunately, there's a museum in Kentucky that still posits this very archaic and very wrong idea. Hutton's understanding of gradual geology opposed this age, as 6,000 years is not a long enough time to carry out geological processes. Another geologist, Charles Lyell, supported Hutton's views of an older Earth, which influenced Darwin to state that not only do geological events have time for gradual change, but species can change gradually with a much older Earth. Which brings me to my next person. So in the early 19th century, French biologist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck posited evolutionary theory by explaining a detailed mechanism for evolutionary change in organisms. LAMARCKISM states that acquired characteristics are brought on by many changes in the environment, and an organism's use or disuse of those acquired characteristics would then be passed down to their offspring. One example of Lamarckism thinking is the origin of web feet in waterfowl, such as ducks, geese, swans, and the like. Since most birds have feet with long toes, Lamarckism would suggest that birds that wade in the water would stretch their toes to help them swim better. Each generation, the toes would stretch until finally an offspring is born with webbing fused between toes. While there are certainly elements of evolutionary thinking, such as a relationship between advantageous traits and the environment, the mechanism by which waterfowl evolved web feet is incorrect. Web feet is determined by natural selection, a topic we will discuss later. While many people knew that organisms inherit traits from their parents, there was no explanation of this transmission until Mendel's work later. But if you recall, Gregor Mendel was a bit of a recluse, and his work was not really discovered until about 50 years after he did those experiments with the pea plants. However, there was a contemporary, Charles Darwin, who lived at the same time as Gregor Mendel, but they never met. Darwin proposed that traits are determined by pangenes, which were molecules given off by somatic cells in the body based on use or disuse of a given anatomical feature in the environment which the organism lived. We now know that these molecules do not exist, but the word gene derived from the word pangene, and genes are coding regions of DNA on chromosomes. So even though Darwin and Mendel lived at the same time, they never met each other. Imagine how far biology would have gone if they had known each other. So, let's talk about these two Santa Claus-like looking fellows from the 1800s. Charles Darwin on the left and Alfred Russel Wallace. He kind of got screwed in this whole deal. The latter is someone you probably not have heard of. That's because Darwin published his work before Wallace did. Competition of ideas was rife even in the old days, and we need to remember that people in history are still human, just like we are today. Charles Darwin is known for his 5-year voyage on the HMS Beagle, making many stops around the world, but his one stop in the Galapagos Islands off the coast of Ecuador in South America was most pivotal. There he examined giant tortoises found nowhere else in the world and a variety of finches. Though similar in appearance, they all had different beak shapes and food preferences. He predicted that these birds had a similar mainland finch from South America that modified based on the different environments of the Galapagos. Birds with thicker beaks would eat nuts and seeds. Birds with thinner beaks would eat berries and insects. These islands were the inspiration for the theory of evolution. However, Alfred Russel Wallace, who was in the Indonesian islands at the time, independently developed a similar theory of evolution. And like most scientists, they share their ideas with other scientists who are studying similar concepts. So he shared this idea with Darwin. Darwin was in a bit of a downslide. He lost his daughter, who was in a deep depression, and for 20 years he just did a lot of quiet work with arthropods known as barnacles and carrier pigeons. But in 1859, when he received this letter, he quickly published On the Origin of Species, which explains to the public how life evolves. So what is evolution? Evolution can be defined as any genetically based phenotypic changes in a population of organism over several successive generations. Now, that's a key word that we have to look at, is genetically based. Phenotype is a physical expression of a given trait. So this definition dispels two misunderstandings of evolution. First, individuals cannot evolve, only populations. Secondly, evolution can only affect genetic traits, learned behaviors, a person's accent like mine, and other acquired traits are not affected by biological evolution. A population is a group of the same species living in the same area. All of their genes collectively make up a gene pool. The gene pool is the available genes in a population to determine the next generation's genetic makeup. Evolution contains two core principles necessary for the understanding of these changes. First is common descent with modification. Because genes change and recombine each generation becomes slightly modified from the last. Compound this with several to hundreds of generations, and sometimes this can lead to new and separate species. In fact, at the time, in 1859, most biologists accepted this as a principle of evolution. It made a lot of sense, because at the time, fossils were being dug up of ancient critters. And with this fossil record of organisms that show similarities between extant and extinct relatives. Extant means currently living. The second mechanism behind these modifications is natural selection. Individuals with certain heritable traits tend to produce more surviving offspring than do individuals without those traits. Over time, this will change the genetic makeup of a species. When Darwin published The Origin of Species, scientists had difficulty accepting this idea because there was no good explanation of how traits were inherited from parents to offspring. Natural selection gained more traction as the mechanism of evolution once Mendel and the work of genetics grew. Because these principles are so important, let's take a moment to apply these to some examples. Whales are interesting because the ancestors to whales are the same as all mammals and reptiles, and though most mammals and reptiles are terrestrial, whales evolved to become completely marine like their fish ancestors. Much of our understanding of whale evolution lies in the fossil record and DNA. When performing DNA analysis, the closest group of land mammals to whales are, believe it or not, the hippos of Africa. It seems strange at first, but their ancestry goes back over 40 million years. One of the earliest whale-like creatures was a semi-aquatic mammal called Ambulocetus. Like hippos, it could move in and out of the water, but likely had the niche, and anytime you hear the word niche, it's just an organism's role in its environment, but it likely had the niche of an alligator, acting like a lion-weight predator. Further along is another whale-like creature called Rhodocetus. This creature was more ocean-dwelling with slightly fused finger bones. Then later comes Basilosaurus, looking more like a whale but still retaining the hind limbs. Scientists think today that these were used to help the animals line up the sex organs for mating while underwater. And finally, the blue whale, which is one of many currently existing whales found today. And let's notice the following patterns. Throughout history, the long hydrodynamic skull was retained, and the hind limbs became further lost. Even modern whales have a tiny pelvic girdle, which is a remnant of the days in which it had hind limbs. Due to descent with modification, whales changed over millions of years from semi-aquatic predators of shallow freshwater habitats to open ocean-dwelling predators or plankton grazers. It was natural selection that selected for the elongated head and caused the loss of hind limbs so that whales had less drag as they swam. Natural selection is the mechanism behind evolution. Remember the ducks that Lamarck used earlier to explain the evolution of webbed feet? Though he was correct that this change took several generations, but the mechanism was flawed. Ancestral duck-like birds didn't purposefully stretch their toes. Nature selected for waterfowl with more flattened, webbed feet. Darwin developed 4 postulates to explain natural selection. First, individuals in a population exhibit a variety of traits. Some of those differences are heritable and they can be passed on to offspring. Note that some ancestral duck-like birds had typical bird feet and some had a little bit of webbing, such as this one right here. In each generation, many more offspring are produced than can survive. Of those, only some will survive long enough to reproduce, and some will produce more offspring than others. And since life is not guaranteed for all offspring, the more offspring produced, the more chances there is for an individual to pass on their genes. Last, individuals with certain heritable traits are more likely to survive and reproduce. Natural selection occurs when individuals with certain traits produce more offspring than do individuals with those traits. So over many generations, the aquatic birds with more webbed feet were more likely to swim faster to catch their prey or evade being eaten by predators. Both of these are natural selection factors that selected for birds with genes for more webbed feet and eliminated those with less webbed feet. Because of this, webbed feet are an adaptation in ducks and many waterfowl. Genetic diversity comes in 2 forms, mutations and sexual reproduction. Mutations are a source of new genetic alleles and are randomly due to mistakes in DNA of the gametes made by parents. While many mutations are fatal or make no phenotypic changes, some can lead to an adaptation. Sexual reproduction doesn't produce new genes, but it can mix up currently existing genes within a population. Mutations introduce diversity, while sexual reproduction by outbreeding maintains that diversity. Adaptations are genetic traits that make an organism better suited for its environment. These enhance an organism's survival or reproductive capabilities. Organisms with more favorable adaptations typically make more viable offspring and are deemed more fit. Fitness is a measurement of the number of offspring an individual has relative to other members of a population. We think of the smartest, fastest, and strongest members of a population as being the most fit, but it really is the individuals who make the most babies. More offspring means more chances of passing down your genes. Traits can be selected for or against based on the environmental conditions of a time. Since the environment can change over time, we can assume that the favorability of a trait changes with it. For example, large leaf plants can provide more glucose production through photosynthesis, but require lots of water to maintain. If a large leaf plant is found in moist habitats, this works as an adaptation. However, over thousands of years, the habitat becomes more dry. Small leaf plants will become more common as they require less water to maintain. Many biologists summarize evolution with the phrase, mutations propose and natural selection disposes. Mutations can have one of three outcomes. It can cause no effect to the organism, such as the case with silent mutations in which the nucleotide changes but not the amino acid sequence. It can create a deleterious allele or a phenotype causing the mutation to fail. Or it can enhance the survival of an organism. If the organism survives due to the mutation, does it enhance it reproductively? Remember, no matter how amazing the gene is, if an organism fails to reproduce, the mutation dies with that organism. If an organism successfully mates and has offspring, the success of that mutation depends on how well it shows up in future generations. If the trait fails to become common, the mutation peters out of the population. If the trait becomes common in offspring and descendants, it could lead to an adaptation in a species. The most important adaptation in humans is an enlarged cerebrum. Fossil evidence has shown by measuring the inside of brain cases of humans over thousands of years that human cerebrums have enlarged. An egg or sperm cell contains a mutation that makes a slightly larger cerebrum than most in the population. This human is born with more capacity to problem solve, thereby surviving. With access to resources, it is more likely to mate since the gene shows up throughout the descendants. It becomes disadvantageous for a human to be born with a smaller than average cerebral size. Point of note, brain size and intelligence are not correlated on any individual comparison today. This refers to brain size as a species throughout the millennia. Highly intelligent people can otherwise have average size cerebrums. So let's apply this to the ancestor of brown and polar bears. The last ice age caused the landscape to be more snowy. As a dark-haired mammal, this presents a problem as you now stick out while you're trying to hunt for your food. A mutation in mammals called Shiraya-Higashi syndrome, which results in silvery hair and components of albinism, although it is not albinism itself, but an issue with the lysosome in cells. It is thought that a mother brown bear had a mutation in one of her eggs to produce a cub with this disorder. While this disorder is rare and possesses no advantage to most mammals, the survival in a snowy environment depends on your ability to maintain stealth. Having darker fur in a snowy environment means you are more at risk of starvation, while having the lighter color fur makes you more likely to catch your prey. Bears with this mutation were more likely to survive and thus more likely to make viable offspring, thus becoming more fit. So due to the changes in the habitats, the bears further south of the ice remain brown since nature selected for brown bears to survive in forested environments, while nature selected for lighter colored fur for bears in polar environments. This is how genetic changes become adaptations and how two separate species can be formed from these changes. Evolution can progress in different ways. Sometimes groups of organisms can become genetically and physically different from one another, but they descended from a common ancestor. This is called divergent evolution. The vertebrates all derive from a common ancestor. We differ drastically in appearance. Other times, groups of organisms develop similar adaptations, but descend from different lines of ancestry. Though fish and whales are both vertebrates, whales share a closer ancestry to land mammals than modern fish. However, both groups have body plans that coincide with more efficient swimming, a fish-like body. This is the result of selection pressures rather than ancestry that results in these body plans. This is called convergent evolution. A fish or whale with a body shape with more drag will make it easier for prey to swim away or for predators to catch and eat them. So while natural selection can operate on individuals, it takes many successive generations to see a species change entirely, even into another species. In my next video, we'll go over some evidence for evolution.